Hey everyone, we've got the formula for creating inspiring science video content, and it's easier than you think. It's time to solve for science. Welcome to Starting Points, a series for content managers, marketers, and communications professionals where we chat in depth about all aspects of producing engaging video. I'm Matt Nagy, Creative Director of Origin Story, a creative communications company based in the Washington, D.C. metro area. We're going to get right to it, so grab your protons because we've got two positively fantastic guests today. See what I did there? First up, Nick DiPalma. Nick is an award-winning creative director and experience designer who practices and teaches a design thinking approach to problem solving, a systems thinking strategy for exploring hidden connections, and a futures thinking mindset for making ideas come true. His clients include PBS, the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, National Science Foundation, AOL, TEDx, and DARPA. Nick, that is quite a resume. We've worked together a couple times, and it's always good to have your perspective. Welcome to the show.
Well, thanks a lot, Matt. I appreciate you inviting me on.
Next up, Amy Leniart. Amy is an Emmy award-winning producer, director, writer, and editor who produces for NASA TV and NASA social media, which has over 190 million followers and is in the top 50 most followed Twitter and Instagram accounts. She's interviewed hundreds of scientists, engineers, astronauts, including John Glenn, Jim Lovell, Michael Collins. She's also produced multiple broadcast programs in partnership with the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, George Washington's Mount Vernon, and the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. Amy, always a pleasure. Obviously, I'm not an astronaut or an engineer, so I'm glad you were able to squeeze this in.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk.
When we were talking a few days ago, I just kept thinking about how science video has such a capacity to inspire people. We've had a generation of kids inspired by educational shows that we all remember. I, for one, remember Mr. Wizard's World. That was one from my generation. Now we're lucky to have so many platforms beyond just TV for science content for both kids and adults. But the question I'm asking today is, how do these shows inspire? What makes the science content stick with people? Science communication can be challenging because when you're talking to the public, it's easy to overwhelm people with statistics and complex details that you might lose the deeper takeaway message you're trying to convey. So I'm going to steer our discussion into some approaches that really get to the heart of how to connect with science topics and why video creates great opportunities to inspire. So Nick, I'm going to throw you the first question here. So tell me a little bit about your approach to science video content. And I know you have a really unique perspective that people might not expect.
I've spent my entire career as a designer. So I take a very design thinking approach or a human-centered approach to science communication. As people, we communicate through stories. And like many other science communicators, we share that information through stories and tell science stories. But our approach differs a little in that we don't necessarily start with the science. We start first with the audience and trying to make that connection on understanding what our audience's values are. And we start with the user and just kind of work our way back to the science in developing that science story. Because if you don't have a connection, you're really not going to be able to impart a whole lot of information that can tune you out pretty quickly. And as we say to our clients and scientists, start with the science fiction and then leave that door open for them to really want to kind of explore that science on their own. You know, make curiosity the goal. That's where you start. And all the science in the world isn't going to have much of an effect on a person until you have that connection first, very human connection.
Amy, what do you think about that? So, we work with NASA, one of the biggest, science, agencies in the federal government, something that's been inspiring for generations. And so you kind of have that weight on your shoulders to try and produce some great content. What do you think?
Okay, I absolutely agree with Nick. It's about connecting to the audience, right? So I think of video as people want to watch a video to see something, to feel something, or to learn something. And, as far as NASA is related, they want to see the amazing rocket as it launches. They want to feel connected to the astronauts or to the scientists as they're learning something. And they want to learn something. And that is instrumental when you're creating the story. Like, how do you educate your audience about this particular mission? NASA headquarters is extremely busy. We have so many spacecraft missions, people working, all sorts of interesting things that happen like every single day. Every single morning, we have a 9 a.m. morning to talk about what are the things that are happening that day. And I can tell you the amount of news and information that comes through our doors is incredible. So when I approach a story, when I approach a new video, I think about how can I understand the science and the story behind the science, and what is the audience member going to want to learn from this? What do people need to learn and understand about the science of it? So I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people, and I frequently think of the story as the why and the how are the most important questions. Why is this thing important that I'm listening to? Why is this video important? And frequently with science, the why is the curiosity factor. We are trying to figure something out, to explore something, to understand something. I interviewed our director of heliophysics a couple years ago about one of our missions to the sun. And the most important soundbite he said to me was, "I don't know what the sun's going to do tomorrow." And for our director of heliophysics to say that, it's like automatically, okay, we're trying to figure out what the sun's going to do. And so it's that curiosity, and we think that curiosity is contagious. People want to learn about it and understand.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think, it comes down to one of the things we talked about before we actually started recording was, the why and the storytelling. That the storytelling, story is always key. And I think that's so important, not just with science, but with any type of, visual communication. And one of the things we had talked about was, distinguishing the desire from what needs to be conveyed. And Nick, I'd love you to kind of touch a little bit more on this, because I think sometimes there's a thought that we want to get this fact across, or this, this important information across, but, that's the desire. But at some point you have to distinguish what you want to get across, but from how you want to get it across and what's going to resonate with people. What do you think?
Well, again, it goes back to really understanding the audience that you are communicating with. Listening is a very important part of communication. And to really understand that audience, it's important to observe. You can certainly survey and ask questions, but nothing beats observation, just in its natural form, right? And observing without any judgment at all, which is that empathy, is super important to understanding truly what is, desirable. What are those values from that audience, and then recognizing their behaviors. There are patterns in there, and that doesn't happen overnight. That's not an event, right? That's a process and a practice, and it takes a little while. But you put in the discipline to doing that, understanding your audience at a point where you have this empathy to know how to connect with them. That is not at all really science related quite yet, right? Where science and research is trying to solve a problem, whether it's basic or applied science, it is trying to solve a problem. Who has that problem? Is this that particular audience that shares that problem? Communicate with them in a way that they understand that you know what that problem is and that you understand what that problem is. And then, again, continue to work your way back to the science. I think where some science communicators might have real challenges is when they talk about the science in a way that separates it from everyday life. When they talk about science as something that's completely different or just not a part of life on Earth or in the universe or any of that. It's not separate. It's just a deeper discipline into the understanding of everything that's going on in the universe, really.
That's really great. And I think you're absolutely right, because that kind of segues into my next question about what traps do content managers and educators fall into when producing science video content. You were talking specifically about, how to kind of redirect and kind of recenter what the conversation might be and where the communication goes. So talk a little bit about some of the traps that, that these people might fall into when they're trying to produce, content like this, and how we can avoid that.
First of all, I think the big trap is it's not all about the science. And it's hard because, we really do have limited resources in order to communicate the science, and we have a job to do, and it's a big job. And, that's not to say that stuff is not important. But if you make it all about the science right away, when you have that communication, it does tend to kind of put people off quickly. Start first with making a connection. I would also say the language that you use in sharing that science is, be very careful. First, listen, and then when you do communicate, be careful of the words that you use, that they're not necessarily scientists' words or, as we say, jargon, to use much more simple phrases to explain very complex terms, and try to relate it as locally as possible, locally as in with that individual, and certainly connections to their community. If you don't, I tell you, if people really struggle to understand your science, they will struggle to support you. They will struggle to put any of their time into understanding you better.
And Amy, I'm going to go to you. What do you think?
So I think a lot of times, there's a couple things, is that sometimes we forget to include that human element. It's important to include the human element when you're creating a video and thinking about what you want to share, and how can the audience member feel connected to this thing that you're sharing. I was going through some of my past videos and trying to, in preparation for this interview, and one of my early ones was about Cassini. So Cassini is a spacecraft that flew for 20 years, took pictures of a whole bunch of moons, fantastic photos of our solar system, fantastic pictures of Jupiter and Saturn. And at the end of its mission, it plunged into Saturn. But before, it went through the rings of Saturn and around and captured some amazing images. So this video was coming out on the last day of its mission. And how do you connect to the spacecraft and the 20 years of images and the team behind it in 2 minutes? 3 minutes is what I had. And so it was a simple goodbye Cassini. And the music connected us to Cassini, the story and the language connected us to Cassini, and I used images of the team in mission control as they're watching Cassini and plunge into Saturn. So that was a powerful connection to come across. And so thinking about this human element of the story, and how will people connect and feel connected. Something else that Nick brought up is language. I like the idea of using, so frequently I'll have a scientist in front of me that I'm interviewing on camera, and he's talking to other scientists. He's talking at a level beyond potentially most of our audience. And so I try to remind this person to bring the language a little bit down. However, I like to pick out key vocabulary. So if there's key vocabulary or science concepts that are important, that people still want to learn about those. So how can we make the language around that key vocabulary a little lower, but also still educate people? I think it's important for other content producers to not shy away from the science concepts, is to remember to educate people who are watching.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it's important to, you have to get the science across some way, but you have to find a way to do it where it connects with the audience. And that's really what we've been driving home in this question. And I'm just going to kind of wrap it up, by giving you my thoughts in terms of the human element of science video communication is so important. We talked about, having that emotion, because we're human beings, we're driven by emotion, and we want to relate to the content that we're seeing. That's why we're so affected by, dramatic television and movies, why we can, lose ourselves in a story or a good book, is because we want to emotionally connect and identify with what we're seeing. So if we can find a way as producers to find that emotional connection with the science, it's going to be so much better, and you're going to have incredibly effective content. And one of the things also is to ask your audience to do something. Ask your audience to feel something. Ask your audience to maybe even think about the content. Ponder it. Thinking is a creative exercise, and the idea is when you ponder, whether it's the nature of the universe, or the distance between a star and another star, or or how subatomic particles or DNA form the building blocks of life. That's a thinking exercise. And when you ask your audience to think about things, you're asking them to engage on an emotional level, because usually you're asking them to think about the world around them and how things came to be. And a lot of people, are very interested in that. And sometimes, it just engages a different part of the brain than they're normally used to. So if you can find a way to draw them into it using that, that call to action, asking your audience to do something, I think you're going to have some really effective content. And so that kind of leads me to my next question, which is specifically when it comes to video, how does video effectively communicate these topics? What is it about video that makes this science content come alive in a way that other mediums can't? And Amy, I'm going to throw that back to you.
Well, it is that human connection. And video is so powerful for the mere fact that you can hear from the experts directly firsthand. Again, I go back to my expertise of interviewing people. I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people. And it's really when you just get that soundbite that captures that emotion. Why does that scientist or that engineer feel really excited, and what is their wow factor? Because if they can express to you their wow factor of that particular science, then it comes across in the video, and people hook onto that. I interviewed an expert in nanomaterials once, and he's talking about the carbon nanotubes and how you can mix it with other materials to make a composite, and he can tell me all the science facts about it, and I could relay that in the video. But when we got to talking about the lab where he was, where they were generating enough electricity to imitate a bolt of lightning. And he got so excited. He was like, and we shocked the composite material 5 times in a row, and it didn't, stayed together. Like, his eyes just lit up. And that soundbite just conveyed so much in his emotion. And to me, that was the best. That really told the story of why this nano carbon tube material composite was important, because it can withstand that much electricity. Well, what if you can build airplane out of this material? What if you can use this material on a ship that's out in the ocean that needs to withstand that amount of electrical surge potentially in a storm? So it really conveyed the importance, and it conveyed his wow factor.
And Nick, let's talk a little bit about video as effort in pre-production and different ways to increase engagement. I know you and I have talked a little bit about this in our time working together. So talk about pre-production and engagement. Kind of thread it through your favorite topic, which is design.
Right. So I look at video as a product. More than just a deliverable, but it's a product that hopefully lives on for much longer than just the single product, the single episode. We like to approach video in serial storytelling. One single project is very expensive in terms of time and budget, resources, So we look at serial projects as being real value multipliers because you're, in a sense, not reinventing every single episode. Certain aspects of an episode may change from one to the next, but you know that you'll have certain parts of that video that will be the same in terms of openings, in terms of titling, in terms of program packaging. So you approach that whole series, let's say, in a way that if you had 8 episodes that are maybe a half an hour apiece, you're really only changing about 15, maybe 20 minutes or so each episode. Then it starts to look like more of a manageable workload or production, right? It just imparts an experience with your audience. And experience is just, it's the best way to communicate with somebody. It is the best teacher. It is engaging. It becomes a very individual experience. And going back to what I had said earlier about, starting with the science fiction and then letting them find their way to the science behind it, it becomes their experience. And then that's their science. It's their discovery. And that becomes undeniable and irrefutable. And I think that's really important. The planning that goes into pre-production, production, and post-production, it's not just to produce something. It's also to produce something with extra value to it. So there's a line that I read recently from Walt Disney. He said, "We don't make movies to make more money. We make money to make more movies." And that mindset of scalability and sustainability in your science communication is really critical. And sometimes it is kind of taking the front seat in communication, whereas science just needs to ride shotgun sometimes.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and it's so important, to be able to identify those pieces as you go through and build your product, mm-hmm. and to and as I know you've said many times, design is a process of subtraction. Mm-hmm. So you start with the big picture, and then you break it down, and you break it down, and you break it down, and you start putting it into little pieces here and there, and then you come to the core of what you really want to tell, and then you figure out, okay, how can I make this work within a budget, or how can I make this work within some constrictions or time restraints or things like that. And that's really where creativity drives. And the one thing I just want to close out this question by talking a little bit about, one of the great things about video is the fact that we have motion. And Nick, you and I are both motion graphics designers, and so the fact that we can create and convey a lot of this science topics through engaging visuals, how we present visuals is one of the ways that we're going to draw people in. So a picture is worth 1,000 words, but sometimes, if you can make that picture move, you can make it come to life, you can show how things relate from A to B, that picture, that movie, that motion may be worth 10,000 words. So that's one of the things that is really great about video and how it really works well for science. So let me move on to my last question here. And Amy, I'm going to throw this to you. And it's, you have to deal with this almost on a daily basis at NASA. So, how do you work with your content managers and your educators to measure success? How do you do that?
So there's many ways to measure success. And one of the ways we do is to look at metrics and how well is the video performing and how well is it performing across our many platforms, where we have to think about Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and YouTube and our TV broadcast. And one video may perform better on a certain platform because it was created a certain way. And so we measure success by how many people are watching, how many people are connecting, how many people are commenting. And Nick had mentioned the concept of series, and I'm in the process of co-producing the Ask NASA series. And so particularly with this series, I've been very closely tracking how many questions we're receiving. So we'll do a social media solicit about a certain topic like space station, and how many questions are coming in, and are all the questions similar? Like, are there questions about the solar arrays? Did 10 people send in a question about the solar arrays, and 30 people sent in a question about eating in space, which actually is like one of our most popular topics. Eating in space, sleeping in space, that's definitely the most popular topics. So we sort of measure like what are people interested in Ask NASA, and how can we answer those questions? So, I mean, there's different ways to think about that as you're creating something, what is going to connect to the audience. And the return on investment is when you have this series that's growing over time and you can continue to develop it over time.
That's really great. And I think it's so important to be able to, go through those metrics, look at them, interpret them, look at the data, and then really interpret the data. Because I've said many times, like, the data doesn't lie, but the value lies in how the data is interpreted. So, Nick, I'm going to throw this to you. Let's talk about something that you've mentioned many times. You talk about requirements versus expectations. How does that measure in with success?
We even start with scientists and our clients and customers, measuring success. Let's first define success. What does success look like for you as a scientist, as a researcher, as a technologist? And what are some of these bold ideas that you want to really achieve? And we really do encourage our scientists to be very bold in what are their milestones? What do they want to achieve? What does success look like to you? And we are very careful to explain to them that don't have expectations. Don't keep them inside your brain. You have to communicate them. Let's have requirements instead. Typically, expectations are these things that you keep to yourself, and you expect people to respond to your science video a particular way. Chances are, if you go into it with those expectations, you're going to be disappointed. Instead, let's start with requirements. How do you want people to respond? If they do, how do you want them to respond? A lot of times, like you mentioned before, you want to ask them to respond in a certain way, like follow us or like us or subscribe to us on YouTube, or maybe there's even donate a Patreon or something to that effect. Scientists have a very hard time asking people to do things, and we get it. We want it. They're very concerned about keeping their credibility and their integrity and their positions intact and safe, and I totally get that. It makes sense. However, the expectation that if you don't be more human and connect with people in a way that might degrade your position as a scientist, it's just false. In fact, I would say if you don't do that, you will be risking some credibility with your audience by not being more human. Don't have science face. Smile. Because when you smile, people tend to smile with you. I mean, it's very basic, kind of this idea of mirror neurons, that if you want somebody to act a certain way, try acting that way first to make people feel, I don't know, maybe a little safer, more secure in acting that way, that it's okay. Expectations really will kind of lead to some disappointment, but when you vocalize them and communicate them, they become requirements. And then you have items that you can check off. And that's another way to really measure the success of a science series or any science communication.
Yeah, I think that's great, because I think it's important, like you said, to A, identify what success looks like, and then B, also understand where your audience is, how they interact with your content, what platforms they might be on. Certain audiences are on different platforms for different reasons. And for any content managers or educators that might be watching this, that's one of the most important things to understand. And I've worked with people who, some of them have a good understanding of it, others don't. And then they can see the fluctuation of the performance in the in the content that they put out, sometimes it's put out and, they're wondering, why isn't this performing? Why isn't, why are people watching this? Is it the content? Things like that, but it's really important to understand, if you're doing something in your audience, maybe you have a good following on Instagram, tailor your content for Instagram. And if you want to tailor it for YouTube, maybe do a longer version for YouTube, but then do a shorter version for Instagram. So understand where your audiences are, how they're interacting, when they're interacting, look at that feedback, look at the data, and then interpret it and make decisions going forward. It's about creating a long-term strategy that adjusts. A strategy doesn't have to be rigid. It can flex. So it's important to understand that you can't, trying one thing and being done, that's not going to work. You need to try things, see how they are, and then continue and adjust as you go on. So I think we've had a really, really great discussion on this. We think we found some of the key parts of the science video equation. So now it's up to you, the viewers, to make that inspirational content. Nick, Amy, thank you so much for being here. This was awesome.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for having us.
You can learn more about Nick and SpacetimeLabs at spacetimelabs.co and on Twitter at SpacetimeLabs. You can also connect with SpacetimeLabs on LinkedIn. To learn more about Amy, head on over to amyleniart.com and on Twitter at @Leniart and connect with her on LinkedIn as well. Thanks to everyone for watching, and I'll see you next time.